Handheld hardware has always been an afterthought in gaming. The platform that people didn't talk about seriously until something appeared on it that had no business appearing on it. This list is for those moments. Games where the gap between what the hardware should have been capable of and what was actually shipped on it represents something genuinely worth documenting. All of them made people stop and ask how this was running in their hands. Ni no Kuni Dominion of the Dark Djinn is the game most people don't know exists. The Western world knows Ni no Kuni as a 2013 PS3 JRPG with Studio Ghibli animation and a Joe Hisaishi score. That game was built on a DS original that level, 5 released exclusively in Japan in December 2010, and that never received a Western release for a reason that's genuinely unusual. The game shipped with a physical Wizard's Companion, a hardcover magic book containing spells, lore, and puzzle solutions required to play it. Localizing and printing that book in other languages was cost-prohibitive enough that they simply didn't release it outside Japan. A fan translation completed in 2018 after 8 years of work finally made it accessible. The DS version is not an inferior port of the PS3 game. It's the original. The PS3 version is an expanded remake of this. The story is the same. Oliver's mother dies, and he travels to a parallel world to save her. The Studio Ghibli animated sequences appear here, scaled for the DS screens. The score runs throughout. The combat is turn-based with Dragon Quest-style menu structure rather than the PS3's real-time system. And the Imagine Creature Collection is more central to the DS design than the remake. The DS version ends with Shadar's defeat. The PS3 version extends the story significantly, with a White Witch arc playing the DS original through the fan translation. With a translated Wizard's Companion, is the closest experience to what Japanese players received in 2010, a complete JRPG that never had a reason to exist on DS hardware until they put it there anyway. Xenoblade Chronicles 3D is a new Nintendo 3DS exclusive, not compatible with the standard 3DS. And that distinction is the entire story of how it exists. Monolith Soft's 2010 Wii RPG was one of the largest and most technically demanding games on that platform. A 40 to 80-hour open-world JRPG with sprawling vistas, hundreds of enemies on screen, real-time combat across enormous biomes, and a draw distance that used the Wii hardware extensively. Getting that onto a handheld required the additional ARM11 CPU core and improved GPU in the new 3DS specifically. On original 3DS hardware, the port simply doesn't run. The conversion required reducing model polygon counts, cutting environmental detail, and compressing textures throughout. The comparison screenshots are visible and unflattering if you're looking for them. The top screen resolution sits at 400 by 240, and the game's original cinematic scope doesn't map onto a 3.5-inch display without loss. What survived intact is everything that made the game worth playing. The playable continents, the Monado's future vision combat mechanic, the colony drama and its characters, and the full 80-hour scope of the main campaign and post-game content. The port also added a new prologue chapter. This is not the best way to play Xenoblade Chronicles. The definitive edition on Switch is that, but is the most improbable way, and the fact that it functions coherently as a portable JRPG remains genuinely impressive. Street Fighter Alpha 3 Max on PSP in 2006 is technically a fighting game, but the World Tour mode is the reason it belongs on this list. And the reason the PSP version is the definitive edition of a game that had appeared on PlayStation, Saturn, Dreamcast, and GBA before it. World Tour is an RPG progression layer wrapped around Alpha 3's fighting. You select a character and fighting style, travel a global map through mission-based fights, earn experience that levels stats and unlocks abilities from other ISMs, and gradually build a custom fighter with a move set that the base roster doesn't have. Completing World Tour with every character reveals additional hidden fighters. The PSP version added exclusive characters from the GBA release. The World Tour implementation achieves something that fighting games rarely attempt: a single-player mode with meaningful long-term progression that changes how individual characters feel rather than just unlocking cosmetics. The PSP's D-pad is widely acknowledged as inferior for the precision that fighting games require. Quarter-circle inputs in particular require more deliberateness than an arcade stick or the Dreamcast pad, and Capcom created limited edition adhesive D-pad attachments to compensate. The roster at 39 fighters was the largest the series had produced, with 10 unlocked modes from the start, ad hoc multiplayer for up to 8 players, and a world tour that absorbed players for dozens of hours. It's one of the most complete portable fighting games ever shipped. Tales of the Abyss on 3DS in 2011 is one of those ports that succeeds almost entirely by existing. The PS2 original, released in 2006, never reached PAL territories. Europeans and Australians had no legal way to play it. The 3DS version was its first appearance in Europe and its first handheld release, and Namco Bandai accomplished the conversion with the game's fundamental integrity intact. The full 60-hour JRPG story across the world of Alderant, the Flex Range linear motion battle system, all voice acting, all cutscenes, fits on a 3DS cartridge and runs without the lengthy load times that marred the PS2 original. The visual reduction from PS2 to 3DS is measurable but not ruinous. Character models hold up given the screen size, background geometry was simplified, and some frame rate drops occur on the world map in specific areas. The 3D effect was broadly considered a disappointment. Depth is present in some scenes and absent or counterproductive in others, and most players turn it off within the first hour. The base game was carried across without additional content, which frustrated players who had already completed the PS2 version. But for the majority of players who hadn't, and for the entire PAL market, which numbered in the tens of millions, it was the only version that existed in their region. Namco based the 3DS release on the North American PS2 version, which meant Japanese players received new arts not present in their original release. As a port that justified handheld ownership for a significant portion of its audience, and as the first legal way to play the game for half the world, it earns its place here. Chrono Trigger on Nintendo DS in 2008 is the version Yasunori Mitsuda's debut work. 13 years after the SNES original, arriving on hardware, he felt suited it. Square built the DS version from the original source code rather than the PS1 port, which eliminated the PS1 version's notorious load times and preserved the game's timing-based combat at its intended speed. The dual-screen layout moved all battle menus to the lower screen, leaving the top screen entirely for the game world. The cleanest presentation the game had received on any platform. Masato Kato, who wrote the original script, oversaw the new content. That new content is mixed in quality. The Lost Sanctum is a fetch quest dungeon that most players completed once and never revisited. The Arena of the Ages is a monster training mode with local wireless connectivity that adds depth for dedicated players and is skippable for everyone else. The Dimensional Vortex dungeons and the new ending that follows them are the genuine addition. 3 extra areas with new items and a closing scene that directly addresses Chrono Cross continuity for players who wanted that closure. The retranslation is more literal than the original and controversially replaced the archaic English with standard modern dialogue, which divided players who'd grown attached to the original characterization. The animated cutscenes from the PS1 version carried across without the load times that accompanied them there. Still the most complete and best performing version of one of the best RPGs ever made. The Witcher 3 Wild Hunt on Nintendo Switch arrived in 2019 and is one of the most technically improbable ports in gaming history. The base PC version of the game required a GPU capable of handling DX11 at high settings, with the recommended spec including a GTX 970 or equivalent. The Nintendo Switch contains a custom NVIDIA Tegra chip running at somewhere between a fraction and a half of the performance of that target GPU, depending on whether the Switch is docked or in handheld mode. Saber Interactive spent 2 years on the conversion, and the result runs at 30 frames per second in docked mode and a dynamic 540p to 720p in handheld, with significant texture reduction, draw distance cuts, and shadow quality reduction throughout. What Saber preserved is everything that made The Witcher 3 a defining open-world RPG. The full 100-hour campaign, including both DLC expansions, the narrative and dialogue system, Gwent, the crafting and alchemy, the monster encounter design, and the moment-to-moment feel of moving through the world. The 2022 next-gen update was eventually ported to Switch as well, adding the Netflix show crossover content and visual improvements. Playing the game in handheld mode, a game that in 2015 required a mid-range desktop computer, is the kind of thing that requires a moment of adjustment the first time it happens. The visual compromises are clearly visible. The game itself is complete and functions as a demonstration of what could be accomplished on Switch hardware with dedicated porting work rather than a rushed conversion. It remains the benchmark. Final Fantasy IX's 2016 remaster started as a mobile game, and the mobile origins are visible throughout. Square Enix rebuilt the character models in high resolution while leaving the original pre-rendered backgrounds untouched. The result is a contrast between sharp new character sprites moving across blurry 1,999 backgrounds that players notice most in close-up scenes. The battle UI was enlarged for touchscreen use and never properly adapted back down for non-touch play. The music compression introduced in the mobile build produced audio quality lower than the original PS1 disc, and a persistent bug across all modern versions causes the field music to restart from the beginning after every battle rather than resuming where it left off, a flaw that exists in the Switch, PC, and PS4 releases unchanged. What the remaster added is substantial regardless. 7 gameplay boosters including no random encounters, max damage, and full HP/MP. A speed boost that doubles all movement and battle timing, autosave, the ability to skip cutscenes and achievements. The faster battle speed alone transforms the experience. PS1 Final Fantasy IX is notoriously slow, with battles loading and resolving at a pace that modern patience struggles with. The remaster also fixed the polygon warping inherent to PS1 hardware, which makes the character models read clearly against the backgrounds despite the resolution mismatch. The Switch version added touchscreen support and the ability to move seamlessly between handheld and dock play. For all its compromises, it remains the most accessible way to experience one of the PS1 era's finest RPGs and the definitive portable version of a game that spent 16 years locked to a single platform. Star Ocean Second Evolution on PSP in 2008 is the remake of Second Story, the PlayStation JRPG with a reputation for being one of the most replayable games of its era. 2 selectable protagonists, a rotating cast of optional party members whose availability depended on your choice, and a crafting system so elaborately deep that significant portions of players spent more time in item creation than in dungeons. Second Evolution brought all of that to the PSP with widescreen presentation, new animated cutscenes produced by Production IG, full voice acting added to dialogue that the PS1 version left silent, and 13 new endings that pushed the total to nearly 100. The skill-based crafting engine is still the center of the entire experience. Cooking, metalwork, alchemy, and painting level through use, and combining characters' work produces equipment unavailable through any shop in the game. The same recipe executed by characters with different skill levels produces different results, and the system can absorb hours outside the main story at any point, starting as Claude or Rena shapes which party members join and which story scenes play. A complete second playthrough as the other protagonist delivers enough variation to feel worthwhile. The main story is generic fantasy for 2/3 of its runtime before the science fiction, setting the title promises finally arrives, and the tonal shift remains abrupt. On a PSP screen, with production IG cutscenes and full voice work, the gap between this and the PS1 original was significant enough that many players who'd completed the original found reasons to return.
Why was I in the sacred forest?
Tactics Advance on the GBA in 2003 was the first time a full Tactics Lineage RPG appeared on a handheld, and Square managed it without the significant cuts that most PS1 to GBA translations required. The game was built from scratch for the hardware rather than ported. A new world, new story, new races, new job system. But the visual and audio quality achieved something that players hadn't seen on a cartridge. The character sprite work is expressive and detailed. The battle animations fluid for a 32-bit handheld, and the Ivolus world design transferred to the GBA screen with a color palette that used the hardware's limitations more successfully than most contemporaries. The original GBA had no backlight. The tactile experience of playing a deep tactics RPG in a darkened room, trying to read small sprite text in whatever ambient light was available, is the primary memory many players have of the game. The SP's backlit screen changed this completely, and the DS's backward compatibility with full lighting made this the first major JRPG many DS owners played. The law system, judges enforcing per battle restrictions, remains the game's most contested design, frustrating more in the early hours than it rewards throughout the run. The job system, building abilities from equipped gear across 5 different races, remains one of the deepest portable RPG systems the GBA produced. Whatever its narrative shortcomings relative to the original FFT, having a deep tactics game running on battery power in your pocket in 2003 was its own kind of magic. Lunar Silver Star Harmony arrived on PSP in 2010 as the third complete remake of a 1992 Sega CD game, and it stands as the best version of it. Game Arts rebuilt the entire visual presentation for the hardware, hand-drawn character sprites and backgrounds in full color, a new isometric perspective for town navigation, and spell animations using the PSP's effects capabilities beyond what any previous version attempted. The animated cutscenes from the PS1 release were carried over without compromise. Composer Noriyuki rearranged the entire score with live instrumentation, replacing the PS1's MIDI output, and the difference is immediate and substantial. The English localization brought full voice acting to Alex for the first time in any release. The game's story follows Alex, a farmer's son who idolizes the legendary Dragon Master Dine, setting out with a small party. The relentlessly warm Luna, the healer Jessica, the sardonic mercenary Kyle, and gradually uncovering what actually happened to Dine 15 years before the game's events. The writing is warm and frequently funny in the way the best 90s JRPGs were, and the localization preserved that tone. The combat is turn-based and accessible rather than demanding. The challenge curve stays manageable throughout, and the dungeon design leans repetitive in the middle section. Alex as a protagonist is notably passive relative to the strong personalities surrounding him. The UMD load times appear frequently. None of that significantly diminishes a game with a cast this likable across a 30-hour runtime, and the PSP remains the definitive version of a game that has been remade 3 times for good reason. Kingdom Hearts Birth by Sleep on PSP in 2010 is the game that proved the PSP could run something visually and mechanically equivalent to a PS2 Kingdom Hearts title. Square Enix had already demonstrated hardware knowledge with Crisis Core, but Birth by Sleep pushed further. The Disney worlds look like the PS2 versions on the PSP screen. The character models for Terra, Ventus, and Aqua are detailed at a level reviewers consistently noted as exceeding expectations for the platform. And the full orchestral and licensed music soundtrack runs, without compression, audible under normal listening conditions. The game is set 10 years before Kingdom Hearts 1, following 3 Keyblade wielders, Terra the physical powerhouse, Ventus the speed balance fighter, Aqua the magic specialist, whose diverging paths form 3 separate campaigns that each run 15 hours and intersect at key story moments. Completing all 3 is required to reach the secret ending and understand the game's full narrative. The command deck system replaced the standard action menu with a loadout of abilities, magic, and items that could be combined through melding to create new moves and carry stat bonuses permanently. The D-Link system channeled abilities from characters you'd met, functioning as a replacement for the series' traditional summons. Long load times on UMD were the consistent complaint across every review. A data install helped, but didn't fully resolve them. The camera handling in crowded fights generated the other acknowledged friction point. Neither prevented Birth by Sleep from standing as the best action RPG the PSP produced, and by many accounts, the most mechanically ambitious entry in the Kingdom Hearts series up to that point. Valkyrie Profile Lenneth arrived on PSP in 2006 as a remake of the original PlayStation game. It's the version that gave most players their first access to a game that had been out of print for years at prices collectors were paying in the hundreds of dollars. Tri-Ace added new pre-rendered opening and ending sequences that used the PSP's video output capabilities to establish the Norse mythology framing with clarity the original PS1 hadn't attempted, and the FMV quality of those sequences represented a genuine visual upgrade over the original hardware. Every other element, the Einherjar recruitment system, the side-scrolling dungeons, the button sequence combat, the period management across 8 chapters, transferred intact from the PS1 original. The game follows Lenneth, a Valkyrie tasked by Odin with collecting souls of the recently dead, training them as Einherjar for Ragnarok, and sending the strongest to Valhalla. Each recruited soul comes with a death vignette, short, often devastating stories about their mortal lives, the most emotionally effective storytelling in any RPG of the era. The dungeon design uses side-scrolling platformer structure, with Lenneth firing crystal projectiles to create footholds and solve puzzles. The true ending requires specific, unannounced conditions across multiple chapters. The in-game map is nearly unusable. Load times on UMD are frequent. The PSP version resolved the print scarcity problem and introduced the game to a generation of JRPG players who'd only heard about it as a legend. The opening FMV added specifically for this version remains the best entry point for understanding what the game is before committing.